In this video, we're going to talk about portlets. A portlet, as you're probably aware, is a small piece of a web page that you can insert onto a page. Portlets in Clarity are generally of a couple of different types. You can have a grid portlet, you can have a chart portlet, you can have an HTML portlet. There are a number of different ones. On the home page on Clarity, you can see examples of them. So the first one, My Projects, is a grid portlet. Over on the right, Clarity Announcements is an HTML portlet. So you can actually insert your own HTML and build a web page that's encased in this portlet and display it on a page. If you want to see all of the portlets that are available, you go to the administration menu and go to portlets. And on this page, you can see that we've got 245 portlets available in the system. Many of those were created, are out of the box, but a lot of them were created either by myself, by CA, by Anatech. You can see some right here. David Hunn is a guy from Anatech. Newman and Seamus are CA people. There's me. So a lot of different people have created portlets for us. If you want to create a new portlet, you of course click the New button and you get a pop-up that lets you choose which type of portlet you want to do. I've never touched an interactive portlet. That would be interesting. I think that's mainly interactive because you can drill into it. The ones that I've used have been HTML, chart, and grid. A filter portlet needs to be associated with another portlet so that they work together and you've got a filter in the usual Clarity sense. So let's take a quick example of a grid portlet. If I want to use a grid portlet, I give it a name. I can call it JKI test. I'll give it an ID. And the content source is strictly reference. So you can pick whatever you want here. It just enables you to filter on the type of report. Category, I think, is much the same. I usually just leave those alone, but I do try to put in a description that explains what this portlet is for, why I built it, when I built it. You can't always see the date created or the date modified when you're looking at a list of portlets in the admin module, so it's helpful to put some metadata in that description. The data provider is the most significant piece here. Data providers in Clarity can be one of two things. You either write a portlet with a query associated with it, or you build a portlet from an existing object. So if I want to build a grid portlet showing information from the project object, then I would drill into this browse window and I would look for the project object. So I would list as the data provider project and select the project object. Now, if you're going to use a query as the data source, you have to first build the query, or it has to exist. And you can see there are a bunch of them here that already do exist, along with all of the objects in Clarity. So you can browse for whatever it is you want to use as your data provider. But the data provider has to be either an object or a query, and that's where you get the information that's available to your portlet. So if you want to have a portlet that shows, status information across multiple projects, you're probably going to want to build a query that's going to pull that data because it's stored in multiple tables in the database. That means you're going to have to understand the database schema and know where to get things, and it gets very complex because you may know where to find the data, but the labels associated with that data are in a different table. And unless you join the label table with the data table, then what you see on the resulting portlet is an internal ID instead of a field label, and it becomes pretty meaningless. So all of that is well beyond the scope of this particular video. I'm going to keep it simple and use the project object as my data provider. So when I do that, I click Next, and then I click Finish and Open. And as soon as it builds the portlet and provides the data, then it refreshes the screen. And I'm stalling while it continues to think. And eventually, I will be able to finish building my portlet. But for now, I'm going to take a nap until this refreshes. I'm awake. All right, so now I have established this portlet. Now I just need to configure it. So from here, this is going to look fairly similar to things you've already seen. I can go into my list column section and define the layout. So I might want to have certain fields of information from the project object. So for example, I might want the project name. So then I have to remember whether it's called project name or just name, and I think it's called just name. And I've got to scroll carefully until I find it. There it is. I'll put the project name. I'll put the project ID. Oh, or is it investment ID or is it project ID? It's investment ID. And I'll just pick a couple other things. So I will take the, oh, I don't know, the priority and the planned cost here. And it doesn't matter. I'm just going to display a few values. So I'll go get my start date, my finish date, and I'll reorder them, and I'll say save it. So I've now defined the fields that are going to show up in the grid. I can then go into the fields and the options, and these are very similar to what you find in Studio when you're configuring an object layout. And similarly, I can put things in the filter, and any of the fields that are available on the project object are available to me because the project object is the data provider. So I can filter, I'll just filter on name and ID and leave it at that. So I'll add that one, and I will add investment ID. And there's my filter. Now I can also allow a power filter or not. I can say whether my filter is going to be default to expanded or collapsed. I can give this a title, but I'll leave it as is and save and return. So I've built a portlet. Very cool. If I go to my home page, I can add my portlet to a portlet page. So what I do is I go over to manage my tabs over on the far right, which is off the screen, and I add another tab. I usually have one called personal. I go to my personal tab and I configure it, I personalize it. I will remove that portlet that I don't care about, and I'm going to add my new portlet called JKI test. There it is. I'm going to add that and return. And as a result, on my personal tab, I've got my personal portlet that I just built. And there's my investment ID, priority, plan, cost, start, and finish for every project in the system. And I can filter, I get OBS for free, and I can filter on name and investment ID. So that's how you build a portlet. It's pretty straightforward until you want to build a complex portlet that uses a query. So the problem with using an object is if you want to see something like status reports, you can build a grid portlet on the status report object, but it's a sub-object of the project object. So therefore, the only fields that are available are the fields on the sub-object. So if I want to see the project start and finish date and the project plan cost associated with the status report, I have to join tables. I can't use a specific object because these fields here don't exist at the status report level because it's a sub-object. So in order to get data from the parent object, I have to do a query. So to do that, and again, this is well beyond the scope of what I'm going to do, but just to give you the how, not the details, I go to the queries section of the admin module, and I can either look for an existing query, and we've got 193 of them, or I can build a new one. And if I build a new one, I have to be able to write NSQL code, and that gets complex in a hot minute. So I'm going to skip the process of building one from scratch. Instead, what I'm going to do is show you an existing portlet with an existing query and show you how that's how it looks once it's finished. And I forget which one I was going to show you now because I was going to do it on this tab and I overwrote it. So let me go to my portlets, and I'm filtering on something. I'm just going to pick one. Sorry, bear with me while I try and remember which portlet I was planning on showing you. I don't remember, so I'll just have to pick a different one. I was going to show you a grid portlet. That's the one I had in mind. I wasn't going to show the queries, but I will. So if I look at, let's take the EBRT time detail modified query. So if I look at the NSQL for this, this is not your normal SQL, but it's fairly close. If you're good at SQL, which I'm not, you may be able to make sense out of this. The NSQL enables you to define the dimensions of this query, which correspond to the data rows and columns in a grid. So that's about as much as I want to say about it, although you can hit the preview button and take a look at the normal SQL code. So again, if you're good at SQL, this will help. Sometimes you can decipher things here, and I've been able to go in and modify these portlets and add things very carefully by adding new dimensions, which gives you another data point, and then adding whatever data point you're adding to the select statement so that somewhere it's pulling it from the database. So once you have that query built, then you use it as your data provider and everything is peachy. So quick example of a query and a portlet, sorry, not a query, a portlet built on an object that is useful on my home screen. I've got a tab called Service Assurance. So the Service Assurance team needed to be able to track information in Clarity. So we created a bunch of attributes on the project object, added them to a subpage, and they maintain that data. But they wanted to have a dashboard showing their pipeline of work coming to them. So I built this portlet. The data provider is the project object, and I pulled out from the project object just the service assurance fields and some of the generic ones like the project manager and ID and so on. So this portlet is specific to the needs of the service assurance group. It has just the data that they need, and they can come in and basically they can sort this on Service Assurance Manager, and by doing that they get at the top of this all of their information that they need, and they can also filter it by manager, and that way they can see just the stuff that is of interest to them. So Jim doesn't have any. But that's that very quickly because I'm going to run out of time. If I look at the Clarity announcement portlet, this is an HTML portlet, and instead of the layout stuff, you get HTML code. So you can actually come in here and put in your own HTML. That HTML is what generates what's shown in the portlet itself. So that's a quick overview of portlets. The only other piece you need to know is that when you create a new portlet, it is a secured item in Clarity, which means in order to see it, people have to have rights to see it. So you have to make sure that you grant instance view rights to the portlet, usually to a particular group, security group. So if you want it available to everybody, you go to admin groups and you add an instance right to the group pointing to your particular portlet that you built. So hopefully that helps. Now that you know all about portlets, you rock.